is not the solution to our problem. Government is the problem.
Do you want the whole truth?
I don't think you're ready.
Governments don't control things. A government can't control the economy without controlling people.
It's Crane Durham's Nothing But Truth.
Welcome back, Crane Durham's Nothing But Truth. The veterans will be able to visit the memorial. World War II veterans prove unstoppable entering Memorial. I mean, they stormed it, broke on through. A very interesting story about how that is really, people have said there's political exploitation, but it's not exploitation when you're trying to help veterans get to a memorial. And I guess the exploitation comes in when you're barricading certain elements of the national parks as opposed to others, because you want the impact of that. And speaking to the idea of sequester, make it as painful as possible. And we definitely saw examples of that. We also had protests, and that is interesting because the protests seem to be faux protests involving the SEIU. That's allegedly. That's what we're looking at. We don't have the full story, but we have some evidence that points to that, and certainly something we've seen before. Now, what does this all mean? It means that we are looking at the spin machine and real people involved, obviously. So it's not just about spin, but it's about the real people involved. And when it comes to our World War II veterans, people that have obviously given us the right to do what we do right now, which is exercise our First Amendment rights. It is interesting to me that there was even a question when it came to the honor flights that are now being granted access to the World War II Memorial to conduct First Amendment activities in accordance, and this is reportedly from ABC News, National Park Service regulations applicable to the National Mall and Memorial Parks. That said, Carol Johnson, National Park Service spokeswoman. And she talked about the DOI and Department of Interior closure determination notice that was issued yesterday. Now, I know I believe ACLJ is to file a World War II class, poised to take legal action if World War II Memorial is not reopened to all, and calls for the president to apologize to World War II veterans after barricading the memorial. I don't think we'll see an apology. I don't know, but I don't think we'll see one, unfortunately. And open to all, that's the question. So that's what the latest is on the World War II Memorial. But you all are so in touch with this, and you on the Facebook, people writing in, always appreciate your submissions on the comments. Without further ado, I want to go back to the slim down, shutdown, as it's been called, and why we're here today. And I thought, well, this is about the government and the government being shut down for only essential workers. We covered that with the intelligence community in the statement that 70% of them were furloughed. Ryan Morrow cleaned that up in the sense of translating it to the rest of us earlier on in the broadcast. But now we deal with what is being shut down. How did we get to this budget impasse? Did it all of a sudden just happen? And to do that, we go to our good friend, the Executive Vice President of the National Taxpayers Union, Pete Sepp. Pete, great to be with you.
Great to be here, as always.
Let's unwind this. I think we'll begin with Jay Carney in a statement that he made in response to, well, in essence, he calls Republicans extortionists and the idea of negotiating piecemeal. But in this part of the answer, it's the first part of his answer, he points to the fact that President Obama tried to avert all of this by putting out a budget and meeting with Republicans earlier in the year. Roll it.
None of this is acceptable. This is just a blatant extortion. And the irony about it is, like the Republicans will tell you, the Republicans who support this extortion game or extortion racket will tell you that, oh, well, that's compromise. We just want you to do this on the Affordable Care Act and chip away at it here or delay there. And yet they'll all also tell you quite clearly that the ultimate goal and purpose of this is to do away with the Affordable Care Act, so take away all those benefits from millions of Americans, and increase the deficit dramatically while doing it, something they never mention.
Something they never mentioned, that getting rid of Obamacare would increase the deficit. Question for you, Pete, is that true?
The only way Obamacare actually would decrease the deficit in terms of getting rid of it is because some of the tax hikes might go away. And in our mind, well, these tax hikes should go away. And even then, Carney's statement that this would somehow reduce revenues to the federal government by getting rid of the health care plan is terribly short-sighted, because we have to look at the things like the medical device excise tax, which is directly throwing Americans out of work. The industries that are making these medical devices are having to lay off employees by the thousands because this tax is making them uncompetitive. Well, when you do that, you begin to depress business activity, you depress individual earnings, and those are all taxable things. So in the long run, even getting rid of the tax increases now probably will also lead to problems. Getting rid of the tax increases now would actually boost the economy. And if you keep the tax increases in place, as Carney suggests, you'll get less revenues down the line.
Tell me, Pete, and part two of his answer, and I just want to, he mentions the idea of working with Republicans. President Obama did reach out to Republicans earlier this year for the budget and to work with them on their budgets. Please give us, if you could, give us a thumbnail sketch of the budget history of how we got here.
The president reached out to Republicans to break his word. What we're talking about here is the Budget Control Act of 2011, which established rational caps on part of the federal budget, the part that's appropriated yearly, both defense and discretionary and domestic discretionary spending. Well, those caps were actually beginning to reduce the federal deficit, bring part of the federal budget back under control. President Obama didn't like that. His budget proposal of 2013 basically said, let's do away with those caps. That's when he went to Republicans and tried to sit down with them and craft a compromise. The compromise was, we're going to go back on what we just agreed to in 2011, and we're going to continue spending as usual. That's not a compromise. That's actually turning your back on the American taxpayer. That's breaking your promise. That's what he was doing.
When we think of budgets and what you just mentioned and the history there, how many votes did President Obama's budget get? I mean, in the past, because I know that one budget got 0.
Yeah,
and go ahead, please.
Yeah, generally it gets laughed out of the United States Senate, and of course, Democratic senators are not pikers when it comes to proposing higher spending. In fact, they too, through the Senate Budget Committee that they control, have proposed fiscal year 2014 bills that act as if the 2011 budget caps don't even exist. They basically said, we're not going to abide by the very thing we voted for in 2011 to try and bring part of the federal budget under control. We just don't care, and we're betting that the American people won't notice.
To give us an idea of how government spending has increased as a percentage of the GDP, because we hear that's falling as a percentage of the GDP, tell me, what exactly happened? Because from what I understand, we it jacked up to about 26% of GDP, and now it's back down to 23% of GDP, which would be a decrease in the sense of what it was put up to, but 23% is much higher than its historic norm of 18 to 20%. So tell me, what happened with the spending? I mean, are we, because a lot of you, okay, we just threw out the numbers, but what we're saying is we had this big increase in spending, and then we tried to pull back and cap it, and in essence, what is being done now and what has been done is they want to keep the high levels of spending.
Yes, they want to make something like a 22 or 23% of gross domestic product spending level the norm. They want to say that from this point forward, what we did with the stimulus is going to be current policy, current law, forever. And that is not what was promised to the American people in 2009. Again, the whole stimulus bill was sold as a temporary measure in Keynesian terms to try and get the economy back on its feet. It didn't work. And now, of course, they're trying to institutionalize the whole mess. They're trying to institutionalize failure. And unfortunately, if they get away with that, if they do away with the spending caps that were agreed to in 2011, that's what we're going to get. And on top of that, the entitlement program problems we have with Medicare slated to go bankrupt in the Part A program in about a decade, and Social Security running into trouble in another 20 years, that isn't going to get fixed. So we have major difficulties here besides these budget caps that Congress isn't even touching. So what we're talking about is just one symptom of a problem that needs to be tackled now, and they can't even deal with this.
All right, let's go to cut B8. And this is the president making a statement about the debt ceiling, which obviously later this month we're expected to hit, and is also been part of the discussion, obviously, with the continuing resolution it's being pointed to because it's the next stop even after this. Roll it.
For example, one of the most important things Congress has to do in the next couple weeks is to raise what's called the debt ceiling. And it's important to understand what this is. This is a routine vote. Congress has taken this vote 45 times to raise the debt ceiling since Ronald Reagan took office. It does not cost taxpayers a single dime. It does not grow our deficits by a single dime. It does not authorize anybody to spend any new money whatsoever. All it does is authorize the Treasury to pay the bills on what Congress has already spent. Think about that.
Well, think about it, Pete. This is nothing but truth. Was that the truth?
President Obama has often used this debt ceiling analogy in the way that, well, it's like eating a large meal at a restaurant, running up the bill, and then running out before the bill gets paid. No, it's not really quite like that if you don't approve an increase in the debt ceiling. What the real problem here is that approving an increase in the debt ceiling is acting like a deadbeat. It's like saying you go into a restaurant, you eat a large meal, you get the bill, and you say, you point to the kid in the high chair at the table next to you and say, he'll pay it. That's what approving an increase in the debt ceiling is. It has nothing to do with taking responsibility for your overspending. It has everything to do with handing the bill to another generation for your overspending. That's why there is so much controversy surrounding increases in the debt ceiling. It's basically ratifying the terrible fiscal policy habits of a profligate Congress. And that's something President Obama just doesn't understand. And it has never been necessarily a routine thing that Congress does. Yes, it's happened more than 40 times since Ronald Reagan took the presidency, but there has been a lot of controversy surrounding debt ceiling votes in the past, especially when Democrats controlled Congress and they delighted in skewering Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush and George W. Bush over coming to ask for increases in the debt ceiling.
Now, we may go overtime. Pete, do you have a few more minutes with us?
Certainly.
All right, now we go to Peter DeFazio, Representative Peter DeFazio. Now, we've heard extortionists, bombers, terrorists. I mean, if you want to actually live within your means and you want to get government spending under control and you see a piece of legislation that is destroying the economy, and by the way, just every time we talk about economy and it's hurting the economy, that means it's harder to get a job. It's going to be much harder for our kids to get a job and see the type of economic growth. In essence, we are turning into what Europe has become of the welfare state. That's what the real consequence is overall when you look at opportunity and growth and what the benefits are, what the fruits are of others' labors using their God-given gifts to be able to chance to do that through freedom and a free economy. So this is not an academic discussion. This is real. It's as real as the IRS and a tax bill. It's as real as looking for a job and not being able to find one. It's as real as your kids inheriting an America where they are in debt to the government in essence, and they are paying that off, which costs them the opportunity. It sucks. Economic growth hurts everybody. Here's Peter DeFazio going off on the people in Congress who align themselves with Ted Cruz. And interestingly enough, he really takes a shot at federalism here. And I'm going to play it, and I'm going to just get your response. Here he is on the House floor. Roll it.
Now, shutting down the government, pretty radical. But we are really dealing here with, for short, Cruzites, or I guess I would call them, they're sort of anarchist, radical libertarians who don't believe in government. They don't believe in evolution. They believe in devolution. Devolve all the duties to the states. Dissolve the union, essentially. Go to some loose federalism. And we'll reach some ideal point somehow. It's crazy stuff, but they're in charge.
Okay, now tell me something. It's interesting because the evolution, no, I don't believe in that as he put it, but that's Crane Durham speaking. But they believe in evolution across the board, but let's go to the specific of human nature. They believe human nature evolves. Our founders did not. Is that why they put in checks and balances and looked at our republic as employing the aspects of federalism as we know them?
Yes, absolutely. And they probably would have gone further if they had had additional time to deliberate some of the precepts of the Constitution. It was Thomas Jefferson, for example, who wrote, I'm paraphrasing, but I'm pretty close. He said, I wish it were possible to obtain a single amendment to our Constitution. I mean an additional article taking from government the power of borrowing. He also used to comment that we should consider ourselves morally bound to pay our own debts rather than saddle future generations with them. Those were core concepts that Jefferson and other founders believed in because they realized it is always easier to consume now and defer the consequences of that consumption till later, later to the point where people who have not yet been born have to suffer for it. And we need to bear in mind, too, that the very same folks who are saying, well, it's wrong to devolve functions to the states are the ones who are saying we need to give the states more taxing power through things like the Marketplace Fairness Act, that internet tax scheme that you and I have discussed on air many times. So the concept of states' rights suits liberals just fine if it can be placed in service to bigger government.
What are we seeing in the Marketplace Fairness Act right now?
I think we are seeing much more resistance to this concept in the House. Thank the good Lord above that Chairman Goodlatte of the House Judiciary Committee recently released 7 principles that would have to guide any legislation moving forward dealing with internet taxation. And among those principles are no net tax increase, no increase in compliance burdens beyond what is faced by current brick-and-mortar retailers. So you couldn't load special tax collection requirements on e-tailers, people who do business online. The 5 other principles have to do with everything from privacy protection to state sovereignty and state tax competition. All of these things, I think, would doom the chances for any kind of legislation like the Marketplace Fairness Act making it through his committee. So this is an excellent marker he's put down. It gives us hope.
What about, go back to the medical device tax that has real consequences. That has bipartisan support to be pulled off, to be taken down.
Yes.
And yet that's been a part of things in the package, but they are not allowing that to really, are they taking a vote on that particular measure? Has the Senate done that?
The Senate has gone on record through a non-binding resolution and as well as through a Dear Colleague letter that's been circulated in the upper chamber with support from some Democrats. My guess is that if this were to become a topic during negotiations over the debt ceiling or the continuing resolution, we might see progress toward repealing it. I think there's a chance, and it's the Senate where we really have to exert the pressure, obviously.
Pete, final question for you, and just a thumbnail sketch, but it's so important when people are talking about numbers. They say, well, projections and less than project. They play all sorts of games. But we also have to look at scoring on what you mentioned at the top of this interview, which was the idea that you're not going to get that tax revenue from the increase associated with Obamacare and the tax increases associated with Obamacare. But when you measure tax increases, are they done in mind of people responding to those with a behavior of attempting to avoid them? And isn't that what we're really talking about with the disincentives that have been put in Obamacare through business as well as individual by that way? Your thoughts?
Yeah, generally not. Some behavioral changes are accounted for in some of the scoring methods that the Treasury and the Congressional Budget Office both use, but they fail to take into account some of the overall effects on the economy from job losses, and especially the effect on innovation. If you end up destroying the next big discovery among medical devices, for example, simply because you end up impoverishing a company, they can't invest in research, or you get to the point where a company just basically liquidates itself because of high tax burdens, you've lost added value to the economy that you never can actually see. And that's a problem policymakers have. They don't understand that the unseen forces of innovation that can tremendously boost an economy won't be known to them until they're lost.
and they're passing laws and they're producing legislation that does not recognize how we will respond to it. So it brings us to that point, as always, which National Taxpayers Union, I'm speaking for Craig Durham, but freedom's the answer, and not more regulation and not a government that becomes the daddy of so many of us, and in attempting to do that with our health care. Pete Sepp, National Taxpayers Union, Executive Vice President, thank you. We went overtime tonight, man, and we appreciate you. Thank you. Take care. All right, Crane Durham's Nothing But Truth. Thank you for your communication. Thank you for getting on the Facebook and just liking the page. Crane Durham's Nothing But Truth. Get to it. Check it out. Go to nothingbutTruth.com and go to afr.net as always. AFR Talk.
Court of Appeals hears another homosexual